I said, no, I think you're misunderstanding. And I say critical, I don't mean criticize someone. I mean be engaged in the contextual space to make connections. That's what we talk about in terms of criticality.
Hi, welcome to this episode of Higher Education Matters. We're going to be spending some time talking about art school pedagogies. So we are 4 colleagues working out of the School of Arts at UWE Bristol. And for context, the history of our institution is similar to many art schools across the country. Founded in the mid-19th century as the Bristol School of Practical Art, it was eventually folded into Bristol Polytechnic, which in turn, in 1992, gained university status as the University of the West of England. As one of the largest schools in the university, today we're home to nearly 4,000 students working across many creative disciplines and share a number of sites in the city of Bristol, including Bower Ashton, Spike Island and Arnolfini. My name's Will Grant. I'm one of the Associate Directors at the School of Arts. And on my left...
Hi, my name's Claire Johnson and I'm an Associate Professor in Art and Design and my teaching is in visual culture.
And to my right...
I'm Marianne Mulvey and I'm a Senior Lecturer and run the MA Fine Art Curating Programme.
Hello, I'm Stephen Page. I am a Senior Lecturer and I run the MA Fine Art Programme and in the new structure with photography, curation and printmaking underneath it.
So the intention of this session is really to offer a space to just think about, share experiences in art school pedagogies, in which we mean the activities conventionally associated with teaching and learning in the art school. And we don't pretend to be leaders in the field of pedagogical research and are not trying to make claims to sort of new ideas. We simply bring our experiences and expertise to what we hope will be a rich, informal dialogue. And for the purposes of this, I'd like to invoke a kind of concept of signature pedagogies to bring us together, which are defined by Thompson and colleagues as distinctive practices intended to do more than inculcate knowledge. They also set out deliberately to teach habits of mind. So as chair, I'm going to try and move the conversation across 3 interconnected areas of discussion. First, an opportunity to explore the experience of being taught and teaching in art schools. Secondly, forecasting what comes next for art school pedagogies. And lastly, thinking about the potential of signature art school pedagogies to provide something of value across other disciplines in higher education. So to start thinking about that form, I'm going to ask colleagues to maybe share with us any memorable teaching or learning experiences that you've encountered that you think exemplify the idea of an art school. And I don't mind who goes first. I
don't mind kicking off, if you like. Yeah. So the thing that strikes me the most about that is my experience of going to art school. Originally, I was 16 years old. I went to what was then Bournemouth St Paul College of Art and Design, against the wishes of pretty much everybody around me. And the thing that I found so important about that was that within that environment, nobody questioned whether that was a proper, quote unquote, proper or serious thing to do. It was like this sort of wonderful environment, this bubble in which that was just taken as read. And in an environment where nobody else I knew had gone to art college and lots of people around me were saying, no, don't do that, that's not a proper subject, that's, you know, what you're going to do with that. I found that incredible, and that kind of sense of sort of being slightly on the margins of what was considered legitimate in education. So for me, that sticks with me, that has stuck with me throughout my whole time teaching and learning. It's almost like there's a sense of kind of alterity baked in to the experience of being at art college, and I hold that dear.
That really speaks to that idea of habits of mind, doesn't it? And that kind of enculturing of you in a way of being, I guess.
I went straight to an experience that I had on my MA in Contemporary Art Theory, which I studied at Goldsmiths, and it was in the Visual Cultures department. So it wasn't necessarily within an art school, it was within a university. But we were very much adjacent to the arts programme. I had friends who were fine artists studying on it, but we were never really encouraged to mix very much, which I look back on and think, missed opportunity. And yet it was a really vibrant and extremely experimental MA programme. very multidisciplinary, and it literally blew my mind. I mean, it really changed me. One of the things I think was least successful, which came up when when you asked us to share a meaningful experience, I went to the least successful thing, was this module called like the lab group, and we had this loose idea of kind of the network, and we were given some framing around actor network theory, I think, but there was one moment at the beginning of this module where we were all invited to travel around a series of different rooms and just sit around a table and have a conversation and see where that took us, and wherever we felt, you know, something was most interesting, or basically wherever we ended up, that was then going to be our set group for the next 8 weeks or so. And we were assigned a facilitator, and over the next 8 weeks we could just do whatever we wanted, basically. And there were some really interesting things that came out of that. I mean, I ended up making a piece of art with someone which I wasn't really expecting. But equally, I think a lot of us were quite baffled by this chunk of time that we were given to do whatever we wanted to do. And we all ended up doing presentations on that experience, but it struck me as a kind of, it was never a waste of time, but it was this kind of elongated stretch of time where there was a lot of uncertainty about how we should approach that, what we should be doing, what would come out of it. So yeah, I said the word unsuccessful. I don't think it was wholly unsuccessful, but it was uncertain.
Do you think the challenges there might have been around the institution not effectively framing the value of that ambiguity? Or do you think it might be that there was just a real dissonance between that experience and then previous expectations around what learning looks like?
Yeah, I think something about framing might have been useful to kind of frame this a little bit more. I think it probably did diverge, like maybe a little bit too much from the other kinds of things that we were doing. But yeah, I mean, it stayed with me. The experience stayed with me.
It's just fascinating that I'm going last in this question, because I can definitely there's associative ideas in both Claire's and Marianne's examples, coming from, similar background, no artists that I knew, none of my family. Oh, that's a bit weird, going to art school. And also the idea of this unfettered time, this kind of these moments of time on a creative program that you just kind of self-directed, and both being kind of first time. So, and I think also art school, particularly at sort of post-secondary education, is that moment where you're crossing a certain threshold. There's that kind of the bigger story about, you know, going to uni or going to university. It was competitive in my day. So you won something by getting into an art school or getting into the college of your choice. So for me, there was definitely this moment of going somewhere unknown, the unknownness about art school and how I had to behave and act. And there was no referent. So I had to just turn up and just be present and absorb and reflect on my peers. And it was a very big, I think I had 70 in our year, I think. And also, but then reflecting on that, and it's quite an interesting question. I haven't done a lot of this, for disclosure, because I think a lot that I assume is instinct is memory from my own art school training that I maybe kind of correct or lean on. As an fine art educator, looking back at my fine art education, this is an interesting detail that I distinctly remember the first moment when we were self-directed in the studio, and I had the moment to just getting on with it. And the thing that drove, and now I'm thinking about this in a bigger sense, the thing that drove us all is that we were all doing that. So it was a group exercise. We're in the studios, and we're all just getting on with our work. Nobody's saying you had to start at 10 and finish at 1 and go to lunch and come back at 2, you know, and meet at 4 in the union to have a drink and then go out. There was a kind of a natural, unnatural rhythm to it that just kind of formed, that you were expected to make work. And I didn't particularly have a great work ethic other than the kind of framework of education that you had deadlines and you had to fulfill a brief. So it was the first time, and I even remember I was painting in the studio when I was just painting and I had to get on with it. And that was really exhilarating, and I was taken seriously. So my efforts were reflected upon and treated as they had value. And I think that sticks with me in terms of the kind of the creative learning and teaching, but in particular that all things being equal, and the notion of kind of being present and taking up space. And that was a very new experience, especially coming out of secondary education. It was my space within an amazing peer group that kind of drove the activity forward. And the tutors were a lot more distant than I think we are these days. They would appear and then they would disappear. And it was a very different ad hoc approach to kind of engagement. So yeah, it was the first time.
There's also something about the ways that you're expected to behave. I remember that being quite a shock to me, and I kind of loved it, but it was quite scary at the same time. But I remember turning up and realising that I had, as you say, no reference point. I really didn't get it for a while. Like, what is it to be in the studio? I mean, you know, I did graphic design as an undergraduate, and at that point, we all had our own studio space. There was a little cubbyhole that was just for me, and then it really mattered who you were next to and so on. But I remember spending at least the first term trying to figure out what the ways of being were.
The performance of the art students.
Of it.
Yeah.
And quite enjoying the not knowing, which has also stuck as an important kind of risk-taking part of what it is to be in education. But there's a particular flavour of it, you know, in the art school tradition that I think we all kind of cling on to, and kind of it's really appealing. But it's a mystery to begin with if you don't come from that kind of background.
I guess my question on that is kind of around the positionings of kind of studio practice, particularly in whether that you feel like that becomes or has been kind of an inherent requirement as a learning experience, so to push those particularly new students in the art school into a different way of viewing themselves and viewing the nature of learning, or if it's sort of troubling in the way that it could be seen as exclusionary for those who haven't come from that kind of cultural background or capital.
Yeah, I think there is that risk for sure, and I think we have to. It's incumbent on us to explicitly talk that through with students. Don't have to behave in those particular ways. And we're in a different kind of environment in a post-92 university than the kind of art school tradition that you started off describing well. So I think that is something that we can't just take for granted. I think can make people feel uncomfortable. It can be very exciting at the same time. But I think, we introduce the first year students wherever we can to the writings of Bell Hooks, for example, brilliant as a way of getting inside these questions. What is it to be in education as a kind of place of transformation, potentially, but written in a really accessible way that you can kind of, well, what does it feel like right now to be in this room? I think it's slightly problematic if we don't address it and just assume. Nobody addressed it when I went to art college. So that was quite excluding in some ways.
Yeah. I mean, I suppose, sorry to interrupt again, but I think there's obviously a threshold for any learner transitioning from school into a higher educational experience, which is maybe wrapped up in this and sort of feeling a sense of belonging. But the studio in particular as an environment maybe complicates that. And I think it'd be interesting to hear a bit more about. It's actually one of the signature pedagogies that Orr and Shreve describe as relevant in an art school context. And they talk about the studio as a social learning environment. So I'm interested to hear your thoughts in terms of what the dynamic looks like in that space.
I think Claire's point stands because having been teaching for the best part of, I think 16 or 17 years now, but particularly over 10 years running a fine art studio as program leader, undergrad and now postgrad, I've been fascinated and also kind of slightly taken aback about the change in cultures and what the students bring in terms of expectation, but also tolerance. And I'm going to be as generous as I can with that word, because I think, to be frank, we had less ability to be intolerant. I think it was do or don't. I think you went to the studio or you didn't. I don't remember anyone being fished out of a kind of being lost at the edges of the timetable because they didn't turn up. They just were like not doing the work, and they sort of faded away as a student. That's not how we operate now. And I think also what we assume is a rich outcomes from the interaction in the studio. Not all students are prepared to engage with that, and also aren't abled to engage with that. So how we meet those students, I think, has become more pertinent to me. I try and lower the expectation to a point of absolutely privileging or being really clear and transparent about the positive outcomes from the engagement within a socially engaged learning process, like in a studio, so rubbing against each other and people changing around. So a couple of things I do is I try and keep the studio as fluid as possible. So if somebody needs to grow or shrink, or they're not turning up as much, we say, look, hey, it's fine, we'll just move things around and somebody can use that space, or when you come back in. And also have neutral spaces, like project spaces, that students can just inhabit and be on their own. Tricky in university terms, because space is resource, but luckily within fine art there is a culture of having spaces carved out that are a bit more accessible and a bit more fluid. So I think, and I'm very careful not to overprivilege the studio as a place of practice, because some students are very productive in their own home situation or domestic situation, and I recognise that as well. So, but at the same time, keeping the door open for that student to come back in and not making them feel like they've missed something out, which is again tricky, because the ad hocness of the studio. Many a time I've sort of just walked into the studio here on Alafini, on City Campus, and just been really pleased by the fact that there's two students doing something, or one student's in the corner painting, somebody else is making a cup of tea and having a chat in the kitchen. It's kind of like an idyllic version of the studio. But other times you'll go in on a certain moment and it's completely empty, and you're wondering what they're doing, and then you find out all at Bauer, using everything. So that's always an issue with the studio, is the ebb and flow, and it's how the group are facilitated to engage each other, find out the patterns, find out the rhythm, and as me as an educator, to sort of facilitate that, but not enforce it and not pressurize it. It's tricky. Any fine art program, anybody who works in fine art studio teaching, it's an ongoing conversation. Friday afternoon, 3:00 in the studio. You can count the heads on one hand, even on big programs. That's always it's always fascinating to me, because in our day we used to get kicked out by the caretakers, because we knew it was a fight to get to art school, and in those days obviously we weren't paying in the same way that students pay now. So yeah, it was a different setup. But also I'm very sensitive to keeping the door open in terms of, and not feeling like, oh, you haven't been here for 3 months, you don't have a space. That's not how I approach it.
I mean, I think what you've said links quite nicely to another quote that I pulled out from Orr and Shreve, where they talk about, they problematise the studio a little bit by talking about the idea of the ever-present student as a masculinized idea of the student unencumbered with children, financial restraints or responsibility. And we know, of course, that our students today almost certainly have work. They may well have other kind of responsibilities that make the concept of physical attendance challenging.
And 75 to 80% of fine art programs are made up of women.
Yeah.
So it's an interesting ideal, but you're absolutely right. And I think, again, the nature of a full-time program like we run here, that needs to be a reflexive idea.
Do you think that suggests as a kind of provocation, we might come to look at this later, but just as in sort of the wider world of work, where we've seen a move towards hybridization or working from home, that the idea of the studio as a physical space is in danger?
I think one thing we haven't really talked about is studio anxiety. Well, we sort of have, haven't we? But something that kind of came up for me when I've done a couple of terms of working on the BA Fine Art programme here. and working with first year students in their second term. And there's a whole heap of students that you just never meet. There's also not enough space for everyone to have their own space every single week, but if you're someone who gets over the hurdle of entering the studio and starting to figure things out, because let's face it, who would know how to use a studio? You do A-level art. I mean, my memories of A-level art were classroom. You know, I went into a classroom. It was less structured, but I don't think I had the sense of studio there. But those students who do get over that hurdle will begin to claim a bit of space, and the students that don't will wander in maybe, I don't know, once or twice a term and feel like, oh, there isn't any space for me, I'm just going to go again. And so the conversations I was having with my colleagues were about the kind of minutiae of the group tutorial situation, and that's a moment to really sort of encourage those ones who haven't shown up or who aren't coming to the studio to say, hey, I'll meet you I'll literally meet you at the gate, and I will have a quick chat and walk you in so that you feel more comfortable.
Yeah, I mean, I think probably one of the decisions for leaders in art school situations as to whether they want to accommodate the new demographics of learners coming through who maybe exhibit some of those characteristics of anxiety and more kind of digital or distant networking being their typical habit, or whether they want to lean into the studio as kind of one of the superpowers of the art school to suggest a different way of being again, that maybe could, with the correct kind of scaffolding or support systems in place, help those students overcome some of the challenges they might face and sort of, again, kind of what was it, habits of mind, kind of change those habits of minds in a healthy way. But I'm making a presumption there.
I'm quite interested in the model of a kind of the Imagine Studio. There are programs I've seen pop up, I think we all have, where they're completely online, distant learning postgrad programs in particular. Don't know if it works at undergrad. I don't think I've seen, because there's a culture that needs to be inculcated into, I would say younger, I should just say art students, that is maybe still pervasive in terms of like developing a culture and a material development and a material support, which needs to be on the ground in some ways. But I'm quite interested in thinking about the notion, the Dutch Institute of Art has a postgraduate program which is peripatetic, and they don't have a building, and I think I'm getting these details right, and they meet once a month in different parts of Europe. Obviously, Europe's changed a bit in the last few years, and flights have an implication, but essentially their bus to school, art school, is a Ryanair or EasyJet to whatever part of Europe. So in essence, they hold the studio within themselves, and that studio then forms, or the sort of studio / seminar forms whenever they group. And I think there's another culture within arts teaching and arts practice, maybe the arts sector, creative sector, towards the notion of the residencies and the space that you can inhabit for a short term, and it's a kind of constructed space, either really practically and formally, and it has a system around it, includes residential place to stay, so it's kind of taking all those things are taken care of, so you can actually be present. And again, it's temporary. So again, this notion of a fixed studio is problematic, and I can't help but always refer, and I do this increasingly, refer to the Daniel Buren essay from 1971 he wrote about the studio, and they were painting studios white in the 70s, and he was bemoaning the fact there's this kind of trajectory from white studio cube to white mausoleum museum, and it's still the same. I've just signed off with the text painting the MA studio white again, and every year I scratch my head and go, why are we painting it white? And I think we don't do an art history conversation right now, the legacy of modernism, but it's constructed. So I think there's something to be gained from, and this isn't a resource point I'm trying to make, about the notion of a kind of fluid studio. And I think it will probably end up being resource heavy, because you have to have many more hot spaces that are much more dynamically, structurally. In other words, we know the resources like the ceramics or the casting room or the print lithography room needs to have certain pieces of equipment. So those sort of studios or resource areas are fixed. But outside of that, where the student then goes to then kind of bring those different things together and kind of be amongst other artists, I like the notional idea that that could be fluid and that could be constructed. But to Marianne's point about how do you bring an art student or a group along with that notion that you don't need, to be frank, the security blanket a studio space provides for students who are working in the unknown. If I had the top 3 things that are problematic, and Will knows the answer to this, it's always around studio spaces in a fine art culture. I think the underlying factor is about feeling secure within a new framework of learning where they have something which is theirs, so they can just lean into that, and then all the unknown stuff feels a little bit less threatening. But I think, and I do think that sometimes is a bit of a lead weight, because it becomes not where the energy or focus should go, and actually it's kind of how do you encourage students to be really dynamic and be able to set up anywhere in the library, open up their sketchbook or open up their laptop, do their research, do their drawings, do whatever they need to do wherever they need to be or can be, as opposed to this one place which is 2 hours, 1 hour, half hour, on a bus, on the train. The specialists are there. Yeah, how do you break that down and make it more dynamic? I haven't got a complete answer right now, but yeah, that's something I have been thinking about.
I'd like to come back particularly to that idea of some of these pedagogies being very sticky.
Yeah.
And why they persist when often contemporary practices in the arts move into new ground. But before we do that, it's probably worth just moving through some other signature pedagogies that we see across art school. So maybe talking a little bit about the tradition of a dialogic exchange, so the crit, essentially, as something that has persisted. And there's a nice quote by Moran which talks about the crit as a public revealing of a private activity. So your sort of thoughts on that or your experiences in that space would be really, really interesting.
Oh, I've had some weird experiences. And I think maybe I come at this from a slightly different angle, because I didn't study art. I studied art up until A-level. I was told by my A-level tutors that I should do something academic and that art was a hobby, and I duly listened to them and went off and studied classical studies. But my mum was an artist and had a kitchen studio, so I was immersed in art and going to museums and galleries from like an early age. So it felt almost like in the blood, but it was always something I was like on the edge of rather than, fully allowed to dive into. But yeah, as a curator and then, coming to do more and more teaching and then kind of seeing that as like a key form of my practice, I have been invited to go and do kind of end of year crits and things with like BA fine art second years and things like that. And whenever I've done those, like come in as a guest, I've sort of noticed certain things. One of them was the kind of who's holding the space came up for me when I was doing an end of year crit before the students then had the celebration of their exhibition. There was 1 or 2 young men who were holding forth and holding the space or attempting to hold it until I said, hang on a minute, I'm just going to stop you there. I have been invited to come in and sort of lead this, and I would like to do that. I didn't say it in exactly those words, but it struck me as kind of odd and also like a bit and uncomfortable for the other students who weren't really saying anything, and I had to foreground that I would like to hear from others. But there was also this drift, and drift is something that I wanted to kind of bring into this conversation that I noticed within art school pedagogies: the drifting in, the drifting out. The students kind of sticking around long enough for their space to be visited and maybe their friends, and then drifting off to get a beer to start the party, or maybe coming in late from something. And I really noticed this when I'm doing crits, which we don't call them crits anymore, we call them group tutorials, drifting in, drifting out. There's also, whenever I'm asked to do a seminar, there's a lot of drifting in and drifting out. And I wonder about that because I'm not always within this teaching environment. I kind of come in as a bit of a guest, but I sort of think, so when does that start, that it's okay to drift, it's okay to be here and then decide, oh, maybe I'm not that invested, I'm going to leave. I wouldn't say that I'm someone who's like super rules-based about, you know, endings and beginnings, but I do wonder about that, and it's something that it strikes me as a bit of a signature pedagogy that perhaps we wouldn't want to. I think it's interesting what what are the signature pedagogies that are like, these are things that we want to celebrate and shout about, and what are the things that are actually signature pedagogies that we wouldn't formally label as such, but that are very much there and very much structure how people are learning and what their experience is.
Also, in a crit situation, it's complicated, isn't it? Because my experiences of that, both as a student and as a teacher, are that you're being asked to critique each other's work, to engage critically with other people's work, and that's a whole other set of skills that have to be learned. And sometimes you're doing that with no kind of reference points, like what does it mean to do this politely, or to what do we mean by criticality? And I think, my memories of that as a student was that could be quite brutal, and nobody really had the skills to know quite what that meant. There was no teaching about that. I'd like to think now we do it a bit differently, that we're kind of, we address what that means, so that students very often, not surprisingly, come in assuming that means being critical of something, but actually what we're asking them to do a lot of the time is critically engage with somebody else's work. And when it's somebody they know, one of their peers, that's challenging. But my memory of it as a student was it was just kind of assumed that you just knew what to do or what to say about somebody, which things count as important when you're looking at somebody's work. But actually that's a whole set of assumed knowledges and stuff that we need to talk through. And so I think, I don't know whether you guys would agree, but I think we're kind of just more conscious of that now. And so we talk about cultural hierarchies much more. We would talk about why it is we think some aspects of this work might be valued or might need to be thought through differently. But that's a conversation that we need to have to bring our students along with us, so they know what's expected of them in the crit and why it might be useful and not a demoralising experience, but actually constructive.
I hear you, and again, both of Marianne and Claire bring examples which are completely current. I think I wrote down rules when you were saying. I think it's important, in my experience, you lay down some rules as quickly as possible and make it really clear. I also come from a culture of being out of school when it was your turn, you were terrified, and it was sometimes quite harsh, and that was seen as a way of toughening up. I've completely exercised that approach over the years, simply because it's not productive to make someone freeze in terror when they're standing up with their very delicate, barely constructed idea and a form, then to completely trash it. So in my mind, it's around the learning that can come out of a crit, and then how does that person who's the subject of that moment of the crit get the most from the experience. So some really simple rules, like I tend to ask somebody in the group maybe to take notes, or we even record the session or for each one, so somebody can reflect back. We do silent crits, so the student doesn't need to speak. So we all speak and they have to listen to us for 10 minutes, talk about their work, and then they get to reflect on it. But also the fact that you schedule, so the drift stops, and then I say, and we lay rules down by it's not really respectful coming in halfway through a crit, and just when somebody's literally speaking, who's not used to speaking, then you walking in and out the door. So setting some of those things down, and then hopefully the students kind of adapt or match those. But I do think it's around the most important thing for me is like, how does the student get the most out of that situation? And that's knowing that they're within an environment which is safe, and they're in a group that there's mutual respect is a given, if not enforced, that there's a kind of a reciprocal dynamic amongst all the, there's no kind of hierarchies with voices. I've found increasingly that if there's one thing that I run that are really popular, the crits, when they're regular and they're programmed. I saw more students during the lunchtime crits. There were only 2 students presented over a whole semester than I did at any other thing I did. They were more regular, and I was fascinated by the culture that it sort of settled in, that there was this moment where they could all come and support the student doing the crit. So I think, and I felt like I kind of won in that phase of it. But then, yeah, there's other times when you set a crit up, the students are asking for them, a bit like life drawing, and then they don't turn up. There's 2 students. So I think it's a tricky beast, but I think it's the kind of the social dialogue around expressing your ideas within a forum which is a safe space, and it being a quite important way of reweaving the narrative of your work, but also understanding the plurality of ideas, that you might not just simply be aware of all the associations which are more problematic, whether it's around your own ethnicity or gender or anything like that, that gets aired in a safe space within academia, within the art school, which I think is incredibly important. Hence why that kind of, the safety net of the structure around it. But yeah, nobody trained you or trains us. So for me, I rely on the rules and just say, look, it's about supportive, constructive, and that overused word in art school or school academia, critical, and explain what we mean by critical. I had an interview with a student last week, and I talked about critical, and he said, oh yeah, I said, no, I think you're misunderstanding. When I say critical, I don't mean criticize someone. I mean be engaged in a contextual space to make connections. That's what we talk about in terms of criticality. And to see what that then offers up in terms of a critique, not a subjective diving in and going for the jugular.
But it's interesting you talk about no one trains us to teach in this way, but people are trained through their traumatic experiences of art school, and that is for me the massive problem with the crit. And you know, someone that I know just felt like their BA just killed their confidence and they stopped making art as a result, really, or stopped trying to be an artist. Felt that they all of their youthful sort of ideas and enthusiasm just got completely slammed. And the experience that I had of the young man holding the space and asking all the questions, I thought, well, who have you learnt this from? One of your male tutors. And when I went into the staff room afterwards and they said, oh, how did it go? I said, oh, there was a couple of young men who really dominated, and the person who'd invited me in said, yeah, well, to be fair, they are outnumbered by the women on the course. And I just went, oh my goodness. I kept silent, but I sort of thought, well, this is problematic. And I think what I observe sometimes is a kind of modelling that happens, a kind of guru kind of.
They give over, someone else can
model.
speak for them.
Yeah, and I find this quite for me this is something that sticks out as again one of those signatures that we might not perhaps want to kind of celebrate.
I mean, what I find interesting listening to you all, and it's great, it's reassuring that you are thinking. You're being thoughtful around the nuances of these pedagogies, because again, to go back to the literature, these both the studio and the crit should really be very student-centred kind of opportunities for learning to take place. It's really about the individual as a part of a wider society. But I think what often happens potentially, to come back to your idea of there being this kind of hidden curriculum, is that they actually become quite teacher-centred spaces where, and I think Barrow writes about conversations among students and their tutors over time serving to converge the habitus of the students in the direction of the tutor's habitus. So, again, this sort of kind of idea that students are adapting themselves to what they think to be the kind of right cultural approach to their work and to engaging in those conversations. So it's great. And Stephen, it's good to hear you give some specific examples of how you reassert a kind of facilitation of those pedagogies which can maybe step around the dangers of that dynamic coming about.
I work really hard so my students don't know what they need to do to please me or satisfy a kind of projection of what is acceptable in terms of success. And I come away feeling quite satisfied when they're frustrated with me, when they say, well, what should I do? I said, well, I'm not going to tell you how to do that. You've got to, this is your learning journey. I do you no favors signaling, carry on. I mean, if a student's, drowning, not waving, I'll say something, but I will always step back. It's something I've increasingly stepped into the space of. This is your journey.
Yeah, there's something about the teaching of theoretical and historical critical work in relation to this that what you've just said really resonates, because there is that tendency for students to come into the kind of contextual critical component, called different things in different universities, and try and sort of ape what they think that means, that sort of way of being. And it's always puzzled me a bit, because I think my colleagues and I have worked so hard for so long to dismantle those ideas. And so students will say things like, well, what theories do I need? But I don't have a theory in my essay, or whatever it is. And I find myself saying things like, well, I think that sort of misses the point. What are the analytical tools that might be usul to you? Can we talk about that? What are the kind of ideas? So we took to using the term critical thinkers rather than theorists. But they'll still come back to that. They'll still use this language that quite often that is a sort of a bit like a kind of comfort blanket vocabulary, but is actually really problematic for them. So it's kind of masochism in using this language that then is really difficult. And I find myself saying, well, let's just not use that language. Let's just not do that. It's not helping here, and sort of change it up. But there is something, I think, going on there that's about what that student thinks they need to be to the tutor. Do I need to and I think you see it all the way through to doctoral students as well, all the way through. And you can sometimes see the relief when you manage to kind of break that down and say, okay, because what it ends up in is not good quality work, where theoretical perspectives are sort of tagged on to other kinds of work, But there is something about the expectation and that sense of kind of, I guess, where we started from, ways of knowing, ways of thinking, ways of being, and our expectations around that, and trying to be a bit more like the staff, or this is what I think they're doing.
Makes me think of Oscar Wilde's quote about, life imitating art, and whether the preconceptions of a lot of our students around what art school should be or has been then actually impact on the shape of the institution that meets those expectations and perpetuates then what can become a rather sort of hackneyed view of what teaching and learning should look like. I want to move us along, because this is very rich conversation, but there's many other things we can talk about, and maybe as a final kind of signature pedagogy from the list that Oren Shrews put together, it might be interesting to spend a bit of time just talking about materiality as a kind of thing that is integral to the work that art schools do. So I don't know if any of you take a view on kind of where we are in the discourse of materiality. I know our own colleagues in the library have done some really interesting work recently looking at material literacy as a sort of important skill for our students to consider, but maybe where we've already spoken about a kind of hybrid approach or digital approaches to delivery of art school activity, what space remains for the importance of stuff?
I can start off, and I'm interested to hear from Claire and Marianne, because I'm fascinated by the baggage that students bring in terms of what they think that they should be focusing on materially. In terms of the journey, particularly on the master's program, is I sort of stress a kind of methodological approach in that they build on the successful failures to then go forth, and their findings give them the traction or the agency around what to do next. So they have to start somewhere, and there's always this thing, oh, fine art, you can do anything. But luckily I've carved a response to that saying, yeah, but you have to do something. So to be frank and briefly, sort of the way we structure, and it'd be the same with the undergrad, but particularly with the masters, because it's a year-long program, is that we sort of see the first few months as the kind of the sandpit moment that you've got time to experiment. But essentially the critical, is that word again, the critical, the conceptual propositions, matching the kind of a material expectation, are the things that then make the decisions about where those resources and what those kind of the materiality, what becomes special and what becomes important to that student to carry forth. And again, it's in the same breath that we talk about research and practice. I perpetuate that those shouldn't be distinct conversations. We can talk about them in the same breath. The two sides of a coin, maybe a different kind of maybe format. There's writing and there's making, but I think we're all accepting of that approach, the research and practice modality. But for me, in particular, it's like the student needs to kind of make the kind of active material decisions, because that materiality has a language, it has histories, it has baggage, it has environmental impact issues, it has sustainable issues. So for me, the student needs to be very present, as opposed to just, and the students don't do this anymore. I don't think they have time on our program, but I think in the bigger picture, this isn't a framework. The flit around material practices, I think the ownership of that materiality and that knowledge production, I think if you foreground that, the students start making very informed choices. And if they are kind of maybe ping-ponging a little bit, that's okay. But then you talk about that as a methodological approach. And then they suddenly start thinking, oh, I see what I'm doing. Oh, okay. And they have to own that space. So I think materiality is very important in terms of the decisions they make, but I think in terms of the impact of kind of the overall work, and it sounds a bit obvious, like working in bronze or ceramic, but those are active decisions. Ceramic is a sustainable material, bronze is a metal. Yeah, it's sustainability. If you're working in alternating concrete, there's a completely different material, almost imbalance between sustainability. So yeah, I think it's important to bring students on board in terms of the value of materiality, but also, and I'll finish on this point because I want to hear from my colleagues, is that the labour involved in materiality. There's only so much you can make in your bedroom, and there's only so much you can make off a desk before you have to meet a resource which has kilns. And so again, there's the psychology and the negotiation of that. I don't think you can again disassociate what it requires an art student to do to engage in the material practices. It doesn't just flower in front of them. You know, it requires labour and effort. So again, I'm just going to finish on that point. So it's all these things have values.
I feel like students are much more aware now of the materials they use and the politics of materiality. They're so much more switched on about issues around sustainability, but in quite some detail. I mean, I'm always struck by it with dissertation students, and they're, over the last maybe 10 years, the increase, just massive increase in a level of understanding, which is perhaps not surprising, but there's a very interesting, to go back to the previous part of the conversation, there's a very interesting kind of criticality that comes out of that knowledge that they have. Those issues around sustainable materials so on are so much more present for them. They're really well informed very often, which is great to see and increases their kind of the different ways in which they'll think about that. But I think it is something that, certainly from where I sit, those ideas of material literacy, visual literacy are incredibly important, because students will often feel a little bit, well, this can be overstated actually sometimes. I'm not sure this is often, but sometimes feel a little bit alienated from the written word. But I'm note of caution there. I think that gets overplayed, and actually they're using the written word all the time in all kinds of other ways, in everyday life and in their work. In fine art, it happens all the time, right? Rich history of that kind of work. So I'm not sure they are that fearful of it. But they might be, in some cases, wary of the notion of the essay, for example, which we can play with and do play with. But there's a lot to be said for the notion of the essay. But very often when somebody's in that situation, if they feel a little bit unsure about it, or come in and more bluntly say, well, I just don't know what I'm doing. I don't know what I want to write about. Asking them to bring in some material object, or bring in their own work, that, you know, whatever it is they're working on, but something that has materiality, they can speak to the materiality, always works as a way to unlock the conversation and to get rid of that kind of blockage in their thinking, because it's a thing in the room and is disruptive, and their engagement with it is pretty much always fascinating. And so I think, from my perspective, that those of us who teach in visual culture and related disciplines have become much more aware of that. There's much more thinking in that space over the last, 10 years or so, and that's kind of enlivened the discipline, really. And there is something absolutely lovely about students bringing stuff into what they say is the written bit, because it's just the thinking bit, like everything else is the thinking bit. And if you think with materials as well as about materials, then that's what we want to see. We're asking the same skills, really, but they can access them perhaps a little more easily in some cases. So I think it's exciting, that kind of more awareness now of material literacy, and that coming into the language that we use, and using that with the students so they have ownership of a language around what it is to be, to feel really literate in that sense, in that material sense. I mean, I can remember when I first went to art college being absolutely blown away by the idea of a visual language. It was like a revelation to me at that point. I'd never heard that term, but it unlocked all kinds of things that I still work with now, and has never left me, really. And I feel a little bit like that for material literacy, that unlocks, oh yeah, this is important, this stuff. It's not just something that, it's something that has a tangible kind of affective set of knowledges connected to it. So it can open up discussions about what constitutes knowledge, which of course we want all of our students to be engaging with, but so I think it's hugely important, and has changed the teaching of more theoretical sides of the discipline as well.
I think, this idea of materiality is so resonant for me as a teacher of curating, because I think it can often be set up as like a dematerialised pedagogy, so a sort of pedagogy of looking, reading, thinking, talking, like a kind of something that happens in between the mind and the eyes, and then just at the end with the hands when you might put an exhibition up. And even that interface with the artist, just to sort of like touch on this idea of the studio and knowing the studio visit is a kind of under taught area, which is something that we're going to think about for this coming year. But whenever I've brought in materials to the classroom and we've done some listening, talking, thinking about a thing or a set of ideas, and I've given students something creative to do or some materials to work with, the kind of conversation that we have afterwards is completely different. And I've done this going in as a guest to kind of bigger classrooms and had the feedback from the tutor there that the people that didn't normally pipe up, or English was their second language, or they have some barrier to sort of being that more vocal person in the classroom, those are the ones that spoke. And I've really held on to that and tried more and more in my teaching to bring in this idea of play, like making, non-seriousness, because I feel like a lot of people come into curating MAs overburdened with this idea of being the serious curator, and I'm like, come on, you.
With the clipboard.
Before you, I love a clipboard. Learned a lot through running events, so clipboard is really useful. But anyway, I think for me, I'm always trying to kind of like unburden the students a bit, and one of the first things we do, of course, is like bring in an object that can tell others about your relationship to curating. I do say image as well, and some people bring in a digital image, but it is that having something to hold, I think, is so powerful, and it reminds me of something outside of the art school that I went along to, a storytelling and photography workshop, and the person who was running it had brought in objects for us to hold, and she said, choose one, and I chose this whalebone cochlea to have and hold as I listened. And each of us had a different experience according to like what we decided to pick up, and then we had a different kind of understanding of the story that was told to us. So yeah, I mean, I think it's a kind of, but it's really interesting because of course the exhibition and the object has been the kind of star of the show in terms of like, the sort of discipline of curating and it becoming an academic discipline. The exhibition is really foregrounded. But I think what we're seeing now within curatorial pedagogy is such a shift into like these dematerialized practices and the kind of programming and the live work and the gathering and the coming together and really celebrating those forms. And we're seeing students over and again like proposing ways of coming together as what they want to do out there in the world. So it's an interesting one.
Thanks. Yeah, and I think maybe it's just so normative for those of us who work in an art school to imagine that students will be using their hands or at least working with materials in some way. But it reminds me of Gert Biester, who writes about art education as the purpose of that being to learn how to be in and with the world. And I think there's something about that embodiment and that tacit knowledge, which is, about creating a balance with then that theoretical, that critical, that kind of cognitive process of learning. I want to come back as a kind of segue to this notion of play. And as we move then maybe to think about the present, but also the futures for art school pedagogies, the pedagogy of ambiguity, which I think covers a lot of the things we've spoken about so far. And Buss calls it, or says something nice around art and design students don't follow a path, they leave a trail. So it's this sort of trying to push the learner or facilitate learning, but not necessarily towards an objective-based outcome. And there's something in that which is difficult in our current age of educational structure, where obviously institutions across the country are in a sort of market competition to attract students who need to see material value in what they're paying for, and a space which only offers ambiguity might be seen as problematic in that paradigm. So I wonder how you would position that kind of work within the structures we currently find ourselves both working and living within as a kind of wider social paradigm.
So just to problematize this, but also maybe offer a way out of what I'm going to suggest, is that I do struggle, the students struggle, and I struggle to kind of support the students in thinking that they're on a larger trajectory which isn't module-based and assessment-based. And it's a stop and start, and that's complex within the way we teach undergrad and postgrad. To be frank, it's a little bit easier at postgrad because we don't exclude, there's not like we don't mark twice, of course. So I try and get the students to understand that they're building on a series of propositional material, ideated, a directional approach, which means that they don't exclude, they create this kind of process, this path. And the thing that happened earlier doesn't mean it's over and done with. It's not always about innovation. Again, we're back down to this idea of sustainability and things like that. And that's also psychological sustainability as well as material sustainability. I think that's harder in undergrad sometimes because of work's marked and then it's moved on, the next piece of work's marked. So I think it's a tricky thing to frame within a module structure, to be frank, that we have these moments. But also I think it's, and this is way out of this, is that I think that's partly what I feel is the work to do, is that how do we get students to come along and understand that actually, yes, there's a module structure, yes, there's an assessment point, yes, there's a pause between these nodes, but these are nodes, and it's not an on-off approach to their learning. And then see the program, the whole program is a trajectory, where that's within a year, if it's undergrad, or postgrad within a year, or if it's a 2-year program. So I think that to me feels like where I'm invested in terms of getting the students to think like that And again, I think that's probably what I would suggest, that maybe that approach to kind of being able to be inclusive of the output from the student and think of it in a larger term. And a really short example is the research practice module that we had in the master's programs that fed into their larger thinking across the program. So having that ability to continuously, almost like reabsorb, sort of gestate and reabsorb the ideas and the development, and it's not about innovation. So yeah, that's kind of, so that notion of ambivalence means that there's an ability to look back and draw forth, as well as just kind of, do new or do innovative new work.
Yeah, I think the thing I'd say is that we have so many times noticed that students who have graduated maybe a few years ago might come back when you bump into them on the street anywhere and say, oh, now I get it. Now I get why we needed to do visual culture. And it's quite common. So I didn't quite understand why I was doing this at the time, but like 2 years later, reflecting on the whole experience, it seems really important and kind of crucial, and we hear this time and again. And that's really kind of lovely in many ways, because we're not trying to teach only to the end of this finite period of time, right? We're trying to, obviously that's important, and when you're in it, that's massively important, but actually there are these, skills and experiences that hopefully kind of go way beyond that. And I think that's sometimes what they're reflecting on. So there is this sort of slightly commodified notion of the, degree programme or postgrad programme in a neoliberal context and all the difficulties that come with that. But I think you always have to cling on to this kind of hopeful, pedagogic aim that's positive and uplifting, which is about the world doesn't only exist in those parameters. And students do sometimes say kind of anecdotally things that remind you that actually it's more than that. Because the danger is, of course, that everything becomes rather short-termist, because it's measurable in those kinds of outcomes, assessment outcomes and so on. But actually, we know that this is important way beyond that.
Yeah, it seems particularly to me that we need to advocate for that open-ended approach to teaching and learning, and that if in other disciplines there's a more prescriptive model that is emerging, certainly in schools, but potentially across higher education as well, then we need to demonstrate that the kind of not known or the yet to be known is an important space for arts, potential people working in the arts to kind of own and inhabit and use as sort of social good, I suppose, or for notions of the future. Okay, well, just to finish then, I think it'd be good to just think a little bit about transdisciplinarity. So if we think about some of these pedagogies as endemic to the art school, often I think what happens in institutions like ours, where art schools have been subsumed into larger institutions, universities, we find external pedagogies imposed on our practices. And I wonder whether there's an argument we can make for some of the good work that happens in a typical art school paradigm to actually be useful or purposeful in other areas or other disciplines beyond our school. So whether you could sort of summarise what you think some of the real benefits of the social construct of the studio, or the dialogue that's inherent to the crit, or working with materials might do to improve the diversity of pedagogies that we find across the other parts of our institution.
I feel like I'd need to have conversations with colleagues running other courses, but from what I can pick up, to sort of hear, well, what does a classroom look like for them? Like what are their assessments and things like that? And it's something I pick up a little bit through, my teaching practice classes. But from what I do know, I think in a way there's maybe more than we might think that may be said to be borrowing or just emerging within their own programs that are about collaboration, exploration, creativity, object-based learning that may be coming from different trajectories and and practices that actually are kind of adjacent to what we're doing. And like I wouldn't want to sort of be like, saying that we have all these things that need to go out there in the world, because all the other kinds of teaching that happens is like really normative and doesn't include the kinds of things that we're doing. And I feel like what we probably need is like just more forum or more fora for like coming together and hearing about those teaching practices. I feel like one of the things that I always want more of is more discussion about my classroom, because it's kind of just me and the students, and I really want to share that with people, and that's something that, you know, coming together as a larger fine art program, like hopefully we'll have more room for that. But where are the places in the university that, you know, we can really share those brilliant moments of teaching and learning that were creative? And actually I want to learn from my other colleagues in like maths or, you know, engineering or something. Like that's kind of where I'm at with it.
I hear you. I'm working on my own research across disciplines with historians currently, and we have a lot of comparable ways of imaginatively rearticulating projects within the curriculum. And they sound very fine art to my ear, and I'm biased, right? This idea of kind of collectivity, collaboration, and kind of risk and the unknown. But also, so I agree with you. I think across the humanities, I think things are maybe a little bit easier. But outside of that, to me, I would suggest that there's two things briefly would be the ability, or maybe somehow framing, it sounds a bit of a contradiction, how a student essentially can write their own module, kind of write their journey through a kind of their experience of learning, and how that's drafted and negotiated, and then run in terms of the student's experience, and how they can reflect back on it. It was always tricky in undergrad. It's much easier in postgrad, because essentially we have very ambivalent, very arbitrary titles, and the students' research and learning fills the dynamic part is there, what they propose. But I do think it's in something interesting. I'm just anecdotally to talk about the crit as something that I was asked to be involved in the previous institution and sharing. So we had to do these workshops in front of an audience of 3 different types of crits, because for some reason fine art were identified as being really good at doing crits, and other programs within the School of Arts in this other institution, not in UE, as not being as good at it. And there was something that I was asked to do the fine art one, naturally. And there was something around the idea of how do you create an environment where people feel, and this will speak to my earlier point, about how they feel they can share honestly and openly and not be judged in a way which is reductive. And I think that to me would be the thing I would offer up and say, well, how do you create an environment by which, even if the ideas are really sketchy or they're not as worked up as somebody who's like super energetically worked up or developed or spent all their time in this XYZ resource, and it's this big, it's like the science fair thing, it's this big, where somebody's eyes is this big, how can they hold the same ground? And I think that to me would be the thing I would offer up as a kind of model of how do you enable that in other disciplines and across disciplines and other areas of practice in terms of teaching. And I think it's challenging, especially with the larger cohorts. I'm not going to larger cohorts and make it much more complicated. But that can still be, there's still ways of approaching that.
Great. Well, it feels like we've just lifted the lid on a lot of interesting topics, and there's more we could cover, and it would have been great to hear a little bit more about your own identities as teachers in an art school and what that means and how you kind of translate that into your own practices. But we're out of time. So thank you very much for participating in this experiment, and hopefully somebody watching our conversations will take something from it.